Welcome back to the Psyche and Singularity series. I've been going over my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. So this video, I will be going over the fundamental equation of the whole book, which is Psyche equals Singularity. So I'm saying, based on a letter that Carl Jung wrote on February 29th, 1952, to J.R. Smithies. At the end of the letter, he concluded this letter in which he was speculating about the equivalence of psychic energy and mass, and he said Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity would be infinite, the smallest space is zero, which is the definition of a gravitational singularity. So I'll go over some of the other letters that Jung wrote speculating about how psychic energy might be equivalent to mass, which was based on his speculations about Einstein's equation E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So if Psyche has energy, then it should also be equivalent to some measurable mass. And he speculates about that, and he comes up with that final equation. And I'll also read a couple of passages from his book On the Nature of the Psyche, the first draft of which he wrote in 1946, which was 2 years after his near-death experience in 1944, in which he felt his disembodied psyche merge with the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe at the horizon of the cosmos. And then he saw from there that the illusion of three-dimensional space is projected in from that horizon on these threads. So that's the fundamental parallel with Susskind's holographic string theory. So ultimately, I'll be saying that Jung's archetype of the self is equivalent to the central singularity of the cosmos and the encompassing horizon. And more specifically, the self is understood as the relationship between the polar opposites of the conscious ego and the collective unconscious mind. And I'm identifying the conscious ego with the central point, the central singularity, and the collective unconscious mind with the holographic horizon of the cosmos, the encompassing sphere. Although the outermost sphere from our perspective would seem like the center of the universe from someone on a planet out there, and we would seem to be at the horizon, just like our own inner thoughts are consciousness to each of us, but that's completely unknown or unconscious to everybody else. So the polarity between the central singularity and the encompassing horizon is mirrored by the complementarity between the conscious ego and the collective unconscious mind. So getting into this material here, I will start with another letter that Jung wrote February 25th, 1953. And I'm going to read it from the computer screen over here. Jung wrote about dinners that he had with Einstein himself. So how was Jung qualified to comment on the parallels between psychology and physics? Well, at least he learned about special relativity from Einstein himself. So in this letter he wrote to Carl Selig, he said, Professor Einstein was my guest on several occasions at dinner. These were very early days when Einstein was developing his first theory of relativity. It was Einstein who first started me off thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space and their psychic conditionality. More than 30 years later, this stimulus led to my relation with the physicist Professor W. Pauli and to my thesis of psychic synchronicity. So, when he mentions Einstein's first theory of relativity, that implies he knows that Einstein has a second theory, or the general theory of relativity. And it is in the context of the general theory of relativity that his letter about the equivalence of psyche and mass is written. So he is thinking in terms of general relativity. And that will lead me to translate his final sentence, Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space, through a general relativity perspective, and that would be the definition of a gravitational singularity. So, as a prelude to this the letter, the Leap Day letter I call it, because it was written on Leap Day 1952, So I just want to give a little bit of a context. So On the Nature of the Psyche was a book he wrote starting in 1946. It was republished in 1954. And actually the first passage I'll quote was also quoted by Erwin Schrödinger, one of the co-discoverers of quantum mechanics. The Schrödinger wave function describes the wave of probability. It was the first equation, and then that was mixed with Heisenberg's matrix mathematics, and Heisenberg also quoted Carl Jung as an authority. So here, in his book Mind and Matter, Schrödinger quotes from Jung's book On the Nature of the Psyche, and the passage is where Jung writes, "The psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders and the sine qua non of the world as an object. It is in the highest degree odd that Western man, with but very few and ever fewer exceptions, apparently pays so little regard to this fact. Swamped by the knowledge of external objects, the subject of all knowledge has been temporarily eclipsed to the point of seeming non-existence." So to comment on that, Schrödinger says, "Mind has erected the objective outside world of the natural philosopher out of its own stuff. Mind could not cope with this gigantic task otherwise than by this simplifying device of excluding itself, withdrawing from its conceptual creation. Hence, the latter does not contain its creator." So Jung and Schrödinger both say the objective world only exists as an objective world because we're perceiving it from our own subjective point of view. And yet, nowhere in this objective mechanistic worldview is there a space for the psyche, which is the source of this objective material world, so says Schrödinger and Jung. And the metaphor I use is that the eye, you've never seen your own eyeball. You've seen reflections of your eyeball in a mirror, but because it's the source of your field of vision, you can't see your own eye. And similarly, because it's the source of the objective material world, you can't see your psyche. But the implication is if you trace space-time, which is the objective world of space, material objects existing in space and time, if you trace that back to its source, you'll find the psyche, and that does support the equation of the psyche with the gravitational singularity, because space and time did emerge from the singularity of the Big Bang. All right, so another quote that I want to quote from On the Nature of the Psyche is, he says, "Our present knowledge," Carl Jung says, "our present knowledge does not allow us to do much more than compare the relation of the psychic to the material world with two cones whose apices, in a point without extension, a real 0 point, touch and do not touch." So the image of two cones connected by their points, their apices, or their optices. So these cones are like that. A real 0 point, a point without extension. Well, that would be the gravitational singularity. And that, because it's a point without extension, it's infinitely dense, zero volume, and Carl Jung calls it a real 0 point. That would be the perfect definition of a gravitational singularity. So this also leads up to his idea of the psychoid. So the singularity, it's not psychic, and it's not material because it's the source of both. Those are the archetypes. And the word that Jung uses is psychoid. It's the source of matter and mind. And it's responsible for the mirror symmetry between the laws of physics and the laws of psychology. So another quote here that I have in the book, Jung says, "The psyche is the world's pivot. Not only is it the one great condition for the existence of a world at all, it is also an intervention in the existing natural order, and no one can say with certainty where this intervention will finally end." So the psyche is the world's pivot, and I'm saying so is the singularity. It's the pivot upon which mind and matter meet. It's also an intervention in the existing natural order because it's infinitely dense. It's not a material thing. It stands outside of space and time. In the previous videos, we went over the history of the gravitational singularity, which was the laws of physics from Newton to special relativity, general relativity, quantum mechanics, and string theory, and ultimately holographic string theory. And we went over the philosophical history of the concept of a self from Plato's idea up to Jung, through Kant to Jung. So this idea of an intervention in the natural order of things. The singularity is outside of space because it's zero volume. It's outside of time because it's infinitely dense, which is equivalent to being infinitely fast. And we know, according to relativity theory, the faster you go, the slower your clocks would be measuring time. At the speed of light, time stops. So the singularity is a place outside of space and time, and yet it's the source of space and time, and there's no telling where its intervention will finally end. And I'm saying that it doesn't end. If the psyche is the singularity, its intervention, it's located at every point of three-dimensional space. In the quantum vacuum, it's located at every point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. And each of us perceives ourselves to be the center of the universe. Wherever you are in the universe, you will perceive the galaxies expanding away from you at an exponential rate, which reaches the speed of light in a spherical horizon surrounding you, with as the center perceiving point of the universe. Each of us is our own unique center of the universe. And yet another point that I mentioned in previous videos is that although the gravitational singularities appear in different points of space and time, they're all outside of space and time. And so by Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, they're all identical, at least from the perspective of being identically shaped, which is a point, and non-differentiatable, if that's a word, through spatial and temporal concepts. Maybe they differ psychically, and Leibniz, for example, says the monads do differ in their psychic lives, but they don't differ in terms of any material differences in space and time. So I will now move on to a letter. Now, this is another equation that Carl Jung wrote in On Nature of the Psyche. And he says, the formula for kinetic energy, E equals mass times velocity squared divided by 2, contains the factors m, mass, and v, velocity, and these would appear to be incommensurable with the nature of the empirical psyche. If psychology nevertheless insists on employing its own concept of energy for the purpose of expressing the activity, energia of the psyche, it is not, of course, being used as a mathematical formula, but only as its analogy. But note, this analogy is itself an older intuitive idea from which the concept of physical energy originally developed. The latter rests on earlier applications of an energia not mathematically defined, which can be traced back to the primitive or archaic idea of the extraordinarily potent. In psychology, the exact measurement of quantities is replaced by an approximate determination of qualitative intensities. That qualitative is, I put that word in there because that's what he means. So I'll read this again. In psychology, the exact measurement of quantities is replaced by an approximate determination of qualitative intensities, for which purpose, in strict contrast to physics, we enlist the function of feeling, valuation. The latter takes the place in psychology of concrete measurement in physics. Okay, so he's saying in psychology, the term energy isn't the same kind of energy that physicists measure. But he's saying the kind of energy physicists measure is rooted in an archetype, an archaic idea, or an archetype of the collective unconscious mind of what he calls energia. I think that's how you pronounce it. But it means extraordinarily potent. And I'm saying that archetype of energy, the archetypal form of energy, the idea of extraordinary potency, is the gravitational singularity. It's infinitely powerful. So that one of the points I make in the book is that when something, the intensity becomes infinite, that's how you define an archetype of the collective unconscious mind, which I'm identifying with the outermost horizon of the cosmos, at each point of which the gravitational singularity of the Big Bang is echoing back in to create the cinematic hologram of three-dimensional space. So I will continue now on to Jung's letters equating psychic energy and mass. So on January 17, 1949, he wrote a letter to Gebhard Free. And in these letters, you'll see it's all culminating with the equation psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So you'll see how he's kind of leading up to that final equation. So he says, Dear Professor Free, many thanks for kindly sending me your recent paper on magic. The question of the subtle body interests me too. I try, as my custom is, to approach the problem from the scientific angle. I start with the formula E equals M. Energy equals mass. Energy is not mere quantity. It is always a quantity of something. If we consider the psychic process as an energetic one, we give it mass. This mass must be very small, otherwise it could be demonstrated physically. So there you go. Now he's saying on the nature of the psyche, we saw him say that in psychology we're thinking of the archetypal idea of the extraordinarily potent, and it's just an analogy of material energy that's mathematically definable in a precise way. In psychology, you want approximate measurements of emotional intensities. So in math, you want exact concrete measurements of physical energy, which is equal to mass. Now in this letter, he's saying, no, if psychic energy is energy, it has to be energy of something, so it must have mass. It should follow the same laws as matter. If it's energy, then it must have mass. Well, then why can't we weigh a soul? Because it must be extremely tiny. The mass must be very small so that you can't measure it. Okay, so he changes that in the Leap Day letter of February 29, 1952, and he writes the letter. All right, so let me just read here. So in the beginning of this chapter, all right, so, okay, J.R. Smithies. So he writes the letter to J.R. Smithies, and this is what he says. So this is a longish letter, but it's filled with important aspects for this book, so I'm going to read most of it. He says, the question is, in short, shouldn't we give up the time-space categories altogether when we are dealing with psychic existence? It might be that psyche should be understood as unextended intensity, and not as a body moving with time. One might assume the psyche gradually rising from minute extensity to infinite intensity, transcending, for instance, the velocity of light, and thus irrealizing the body. That would account for the elasticity of space under ESP conditions. If there is no body moving in space, there can be no time either, and that would account for the elasticity of time. All right, so the letter goes on, but I want to break down what he's said so far. And he's saying, all right, when you're dealing with the psyche, shouldn't you give up the idea of space and time? And we can think of the psyche instead as unextended intensity. Well, that's a gravitational singularity. It's unextended in space, but it's infinitely intense. It's also, we will recall René Descartes' definition of the psyche, unextended substance. Whereas matter is extended substance in space and it does not think, psyche is unextended thinking substance. So that's similar to what Descartes said. So you shouldn't think of the psyche as a body moving with time, says Jung. You should instead think of it as unextended intensity. And then he brings in the idea of traveling faster than light. According to general relativity, at the speed of light, time stops. But also, if you were to take an object and accelerate it through space, any massive object, if you accelerate it up to the speed of light, it would contract in the direction of travel, and it would also become denser thereby and gain kinetic energy, and it would become infinitely dense. It would become a singularity if you could take a massive object and accelerate it to the speed of light. So Einstein said, no massive object can travel that fast because there's not an infinite amount of energy to accelerate an object to that speed where it would become infinitely massive and be outside of space and time. And with that in mind, Jung says, you will certainly object to the paradox of unextended intensity as being a contradictio in adjecto. I quite agree, but you'll see he later reverses his agreement with himself there. He says, energy is mass, and mass is extended. At all events, a body with a speed higher than that of light vanishes from sight, and one may have all sorts of doubts about what would happen to such a body otherwise. Surely there would be no means to make sure of its whereabouts or of its existence at all. Its time would be unobservable likewise. So then this will be the final paragraph, and the concluding sentence is the ultimate equation for this book. So continuing here in this letter, the Leap Day letter, Jung says, all this is certainly highly speculative, in fact, unwarrantably adventurous. But psi phenomena, so psi is parapsychology. It's represented by a trident symbol. But psi phenomena are equally disconcerting and lay claim to an unusually high jump. Yet any hypothesis is warrantable inasmuch as it explains observable facts and is consistent in itself. In light of this, the brain might be a transformer station in which the relatively infinite tension or intensity of the psyche proper is transformed into perceptible frequencies or extensions. Conversely, the fading of introspective perception of the body explains itself as due to a gradual psychification, i.e., intensification at the expense of extension. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So that is, you can see the letters written in the context of general relativity. He talks about the elasticity of space and time, and he relates that to ESP and parapsychology. And then he says, oh yeah, what I'm saying, this of course is unwarrantably adventurous, but then again, any hypothesis is warrantable in as much as it explains observable facts and is consistent in itself. All right, so psychification is a pretty cool term he comes up there. Intensification at the expense of extension. So by that definition, the collapse of a star into a gravitational singularity is psychification. It's the intensification at the expense of extension in three-dimensional space. There once was a star, and then there was a point of infinite density with no extension in space, but still it's perceivable through its tremendous gravitational influence. And so psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. Highest intensity is infinitely dense, and the smallest space is zero volume. That's a gravitational singularity. So I will leave it at that, and in the next video I will talk about some of the controversies about the gravitational singularity, including Wolfgang Pauli's own reservations about that topic. And then after that, the video after that will be chapter 2 of the book. Oh no, not chapter 2 of the book, but at any rate, the chapter on near-death experiences, beginning with Carl Jung's near-death experience. So let me...